All right, so I guess it's about time to go. Hope you had a good weekend and that the extra hour of sleep was helpful. So today we're going to basically discuss the origin of land plants and this transition from aquatic to terrestrial environments, which is a major theme of this part of the course. And last time I was almost finished with algae. Let me take down these lights here. So today we're going to look at a few of the seaweed groups, the browns, the reds, and the greens. And even though each of these independently evolve multicellularity, they're interesting to look at together. And then we'll just have a brief little bit about their utility directly, and then get into the land plants and some of the changes that we see in these groups like the bryophytes and the vascular plants, which are the plants you're most familiar with from our overall environment. But I'm sure you've seen some bryophytes now in lab, so hopefully they're a little familiar to you. All right, so the brown algae is where I ended last time, and these are some of the most conspicuous seaweeds. They're all multicellular, and they look very plant-like, as I mentioned last time, with these oftentimes having plant body, or the body of the seaweed look very much like a plant with blades, a stipe, and a holdfast that look like leaves, stems, and roots, but are completely independent, convergent evolution of those kinds of features. And I also mentioned that these are organisms that are really important in the ecology of the oceans, especially notable in the intertidal areas where you can find this plant, Postelsia palmiformis, the sea palm, growing in some of the most heavily impacted areas in terms of tidal action, where most organisms live in those zones are tightly clinging to rocks and have very little surface exposed. This thing grows erect, and it just gets battered like crazy. If you go up the coast, along the rocky coast, it's pretty amazing to watch these things just getting pummeled and flying back and forth. They only live for 1 year. They grow incredibly quickly, but they have this real resiliency to the tidal action that's pretty much off the scale for other organisms in those environments. And to some extent, the same goes for these kelp forests out in the deeper waters, which really create these forest-like habitats that are important for other organisms that live there, both invertebrates and vertebrates, and really are basically keystone species ecologically in terms of creating an environment that other organisms depend on. And they sway in the water currents in a way that can be kind of mesmerizing. If you've gone to Monterey Bay Aquarium and watched the kelp forest there, it really can almost put you into a trance watching these things sway back and forth. And like these sea palms that are in the more impacted areas, these things have gel-like carbohydrates or polysaccharides in their tissues, bathing their cell walls that make them really pliable and strong. So they have cellulose cell walls, but this gel that's in their tissues really helps to allow them to handle that tidal action. Really important innovation there. So that gel also has a lot of economic uses we'll get to in a moment. All right, so thinking about the brown algae, they were one of the strominopile groups closely related to diatoms and golden algae, and a common origin of photosynthesis from secondary endosymbiosis. But now we're going to talk about these two groups of algae, the greens and the reds, starting off with the reds. And as I mentioned earlier, these are groups that owe their photosynthesis to this original primary endosymbiosis involving a cyanobacterium or a blue-green bacterium that was ingested and incorporated into an early eukaryote. And the reds then were, a unicellular red was incorporated into a subsequent eukaryote that gave rise to these groups. But let's talk about the reds for a minute here. So the red algae are well named because a lot of them do appear red to us, especially the ones that are in deep water. Some of the ones that are in shallower waters you might be more familiar with in this form, wrapped around sushi. Things like porphyra here, the nori makis and sushi is made from. And here it is hanging on a lattice of rope in shallow waters. It's cultivated in Japan. This is one of the red algae that lives in shallower waters where you can see that the chlorophyll is a little bit more evident. You can see the greenish coloration coming through. But in these deeper water red algae, the red coloration from the phycoerythrins is really obvious. And these deeper water reds can live up in water that's almost 1,000 feet deep. So this is incredibly deep for algae to be able to live in. And part of the reason that they can do that, well, the reason that they're successful at those depths, first I want to mention that in general photosynthesis is, the rates of photosynthesis are highest in blue light and in red light. But as you can see here, as you go deeper and deeper into water, these long wavelength lights in the reddish end of the spectrum don't penetrate very deeply. They're lost. And the short wavelength light is the light that can really penetrate deeply. So these deep water red algae are using the blue wavelengths, and they're reflecting red light. Red light's not useful to them, and that light is reflected. So they appear to be red. They're not utilizing the red light. They're reflecting it. And the blue light's what they're utilizing down in that deep water environment where they are unusually successful. All right, so the green algae are the last major group of algae we're going to focus on. And these are really important to thinking about the origin of the land plants, which, as you know, have green foliage as well. And this is an incredibly diverse group in terms of different kinds of life forms. Most of them are unicellular, actually. A lot of species of genus Chlamydomonas, not important, but that's the genus, and it's extremely diverse genomically, ecologically. There are species of Chlamydomonas in freshwater, in marine situations, and even up in alpine snowfields. You may have noticed if you've gone up into the High Sierra or in different alpine settings, these late-season snowfields that look sort of watermelon-colored or red-colored. That's due to Chlamydomonas, a species here, nivalis, that grows in the meltwater from these snowfields and has reddish pigments that impart that color to the snow. So they're in really diverse types of wet environments. They're also colonial members of the green algae, like the Volvicalians, that have these really interesting globe-like colonies. And then true multicellularities also evolved in the green algae. And the sea lettuce is a really great example of that, ulva here, which is a marine species. So that ulva that we just looked at is a really great example to familiarize you with the alternation of generations, this life cycle that's very different from ours, and it's very different from the fungal life cycles as well. So this is called an alternation of generations, as mentioned briefly before, because we actually have two multicellular phases, one in the diploid generation, or one in the diploid stage, and one in the haploid stage. So blue here represents diploid, and brown in this case is, or yellowish is haploid. And just like in all sexual life cycles, we have meiosis and fertilization, one after the other, round and around through different generations. But in alternation of generations, we have mitosis occurring in both the haploid stage and in the diploid stage here. So we start out with haploid spores. These develop into a haploid organism, multicellular haploid organism by mitosis. Remember, mitosis is just basically cellular cloning, giving us genomically identical daughter cells from the original cell. But there's there can be differentiation with differential expression of different genes subsequent to that, but the DNA content's the same. So we end up with a multicellular haploid organism. And then we have the production of gametes from that haploid organism by mitosis. So we think of gamete production as happening by meiosis in us, but in alternation of generations, gametes are produced by mitosis. So the gametes are genomically identical to the parent, to the gametified parent, which is a little strange, but that's the way it works in this life cycle. And the name of the multicellular haploid organism is the gametophyte. That's because it means the gamete-producing plant. Phyte is just plant. So that's a good way to remember it. The haploid organism, the gametophyte, produces the gametes by mitosis. So gametes from a couple of individuals get together. We have fertilization, or syngamy, which just means united gametes. Syn is just united. And then we have a zygote, it's not shown here, a diploid zygote. And then mitoses again, giving rise ultimately to a multicellular diploid organism, which we call the sporophyte, or the spore-producing plant. That's what that means. And it produces spores by meiosis. So meiosis, the spores are not genetically identical to the sporophyte. Meiosis results in 4 genetically different spores of haploid constitution. So that's the general life cycle. And this is the only life cycle we're going to see for the rest of the course. But you're going to see different manifestations of this life cycle in the bryophytes and in the conifers, which are seed plants. Actually, we're going to see a fern example, and then in the conifers and in the flowering plants. But they all follow the same scheme. All of these steps and stages are in each of those life cycles. But this is the slide to come back to in terms of trying to familiarize yourself with what all these stages and different forms really represent in terms of the overall biology of the cycle. So please take this to heart and use this slide as a reference slide to compare the subsequent life cycles to. All right, so the first organism that we're going to show you that has this type of life cycle is a green alga, the sea lettuce. And the reason we're going to do this is because this particular organism has the simplest alternation of generations that you can find among botanical organisms. And this is a case where we have the sporophyte generation, the diploid sporophyte generation, and the haploid gametophyte generation being essentially identical morphologically. So these are different organisms in the same species that have a diploid constitution in this case, and a haploid constitution here is gametophytes. The only way you can really tell them apart easily is that the sporophytes producing spores, which do have flagellae in this case, and which germinate spontaneously to produce, after mitosis, a new gametophyte. And the gametophyte can be told from the sporophyte because it produces gametes instead of spores by mitosis. And these gametes fuse, and we get a new we get a zygote and ultimately a new sporophyte after a lot of mitotic division and differentiation. So this is unusual for an alternation of generation to have more or less morphologically identical sporophyte and more or less morphologically or identical sporophytes and gametophytes. Usually one of them is relatively dominant in terms of its size and its duration, and the other one is often much smaller and sometimes parasitic on the other one, as you'll see shortly. So that's the sort of simple case here. We have 2 free-living, morphologically identical sporophytes and gametophytes. We have sporophytes and gametophytes that are free-living and more or less identical. All right, so are there any questions first about the alternation of generations? Yeah. Right. So the sporophyte and gametophyte generations are multicellular, and multicellularity is actually the way that we really diagnose whether we really have another generation there or not. Like in our life cycle, every life cycle has a haploid and a diploid, at least one haploid and one diploid stage. But in these other life cycles we looked at, like the animal life cycle, the only haploid stage is the gamete. And for, say, the fungi, the only diploid stage was the zygote. But if you have multicellular stages at both ploidy levels, then by definition you have an alternation of generations. That's a good question. All right, so the economic importance of algae. We already mentioned nori, which is a red alga. And there are other algae that are eaten directly, especially in Asian, for example, Japanese cuisine. If you've had miso soup, you've probably had other types of algae like kombu, which is a brown alga. It's a delicious, it's thicker textured. I can vouch for it, I eat it all the time. It's really good with in miso soup. There are several different algae that are used in soups. But economically, the most widespread uses take advantage of these gel-like polysaccharides that we find in the tissues of the brown algae, as I mentioned, these kelps and such, but also in red algae that also have similar compounds. And for the brown algae, for example, carrageenan is commonly used as a thickening or emulsifying agent, and it imparts a thick mouthfeel to foods that are not necessarily very fatty. It's a nice texture, and it's put in all kinds of food for that purposes, ice cream, et cetera. And you've probably eaten tons of the stuff, and it's pretty pervasive. Alginate, another product from brown algae, is commonly used, for example, in the medical industry. One thing that's also important about these gel-like compounds is they not only have a viscous or thick sort of constitution, but they also are thermostable, so they can be heated up and retain their composition. And they're used in things like dental molds. Probably had a dental mold taken before, and that was in part what you were being subjected to there. Red algae also are used, really importantly, they're the source of agar, which is the source of agarose, for example, used in bacterial and fungal cultures, et cetera, cellular culturing, really critical for medical and biotech uses. So there's a lot of uses of algae. And as I mentioned earlier, that they have, they're basically keystone species ecologically as well, but these are direct uses that are pretty common. All right, so that's it really well. We're going to now transition out of the algae. And we often think about life on land. This transition to life on land is some creature crawling out of the ocean onto dry land, shaking itself off and walking up the slope. And it didn't really work like that in plants. And you can imagine that there could be some incentives to leave the ocean, especially if it's totally uninhabited on land. The land is totally uninhabited because the land, you get out of the water, and suddenly this atmospheric CO2, CO2 is much more prevalent. So you have a rich source of CO2 for photosynthesis. You also can get a lot better contact with light. You don't have water filtering the light. You have access to minerals. The terrestrial environment is rich in minerals. And at the time of original colonization of land, it would have been great because you could have escaped your predators. You could have escaped your herbivores that ate you because it wasn't possible for animals to exist on land prior to the plants becoming prevalent. So there were a lot of reasons. It was basically an empty niche that was wide open. And but you can imagine there's some challenges too because one of the things that would be a problem, of course, if you're aquatic organism is that you've been relying on the water sort of for your structural support. You get up on land and you pretty much collapse. Think of a jellyfish stranded on land. And overall, you could have some difficulties with desiccation. So you've got a real problem with drying out and dying. So there's some challenges there, and it appears our understanding of the phylogeny now of land plants, how land plants fit into the overall tree of life, has partially solved this problem. And that's what we're going to be talking about for a lot of today. So here you can see the land plants, and one of the really great findings has been that the land plants are a monophyletic group or a clade. So when I say land plants too, we're also talking about some plants that occur in aquatic environments that have been secondarily gone back to aquatic environments. So there are some so-called land plants that occur out in the ocean, but we know based on the phylogeny that they've secondarily colonized the ocean. And the same goes especially with aquatic freshwater habitats. A lot of land plants we find in aquatic freshwater habitats have secondarily colonized those habitats from land. So we use land plants to refer to this larger clade that the common ancestor of all these plants was on land, but they might have gone back to aquatic environments at some point. And you can see the green algae represent two branches in this simplified tree here. And that's because some green algae are more closely related to land plants than they are to other green algae. And so this makes it pretty obvious that the land plants descended from within what we could call the green algae, and that some of these green algae that are more closely related to land plants than other green algae, they can provide us with some insights in terms of the characteristics that were common to land plants and their closest aquatic relatives. So this is a really nice result. It's a little bit of a hassle taxonomically because now these things have to get reclassified because green algae is not a monophyletic group, but you can see some alternative classification here. Most people call the land plants the plants. And this larger group, it includes these charophytes and others called the streptophytes, and then this larger group, which literally means green plants, Ritoplantae, is this whole thing. But that's not important. I mean, that's just to show you that it's been dealt with taxonomically. There's some uncertainty about exactly which of these streptophytes here are the closest relatives of land plants. This actually might even be a bit of a paraphyletic group here, and that some of these are more closely related to land plants than others. But in any case, when we look at these plants that are represented here, you can see that they have some branching in some of them. It turns out one of the most interesting features is that all of these green algae occur in freshwater environments. These green algae include some of the marine algae, including all the marine algae are out here, along with some freshwater algae. So it looks like the early land plants didn't colonize the land directly from the ocean, but they colonized the land indirectly via freshwater habitats. So that makes a lot of sense. If you're going from land to from a marine environment to a land environment, going via freshwater would be a nice transitional way to do that. And that looks like what happened in the case of land plants. So here's one of these freshwater green algae that's part of that streptophyte clade that includes both land plants and some of the green algae. And this is a moss here, which you've already seen in lab, and these are true land plants. So these charophytes and some of these other green algal close relatives of land plants, they have strictly a haploid phase. So the only diploid stage is a zygote. So they're like the fungi in a sense, although they don't have that dikaryotic business. But the zygote is the only diploid stage. But interestingly, the zygote is surrounded by a really protective substance called sporopollenin, which is still a somewhat uncertain structure, but it's very resistant substance, very tough substance that imparts desiccation resistance or drought resistance. So even though these don't have a sporophyte generation, they don't have a diploid generation, their zygote does have the ability to become desiccated and still survive that to some extent. So that's interesting because when we look at the land plants, the earliest branches off the land plant group, they also have a dominant haploid generation. All this green tissue you can see here is the gametophyte, the haploid generation. And the sporophyte is a relatively short-lived and completely parasitic organism on the gametophyte, like these reddish things you see sticking up here. So we have a transition, it looks like, from a haploid only multicellular generation to an alternation of generations where the haploid phase is still dominant, but we also have now we have a diploid phase that's inserted into this life cycle, but it's relatively short-lived and it's also completely dependent on the gametophyte for its existence. So once again, all the land plants have an alternation of generations, a multicellular haploid generation, multicellular diploid generation, and that's unlike the fungi, which only had a haploid multicellular generation, and unlike us, for example, and relative few number of these other botanical groups that only have a multicellular diploid generation. All right, so this is basically all of the land plants shown here as a clade, and here you can see node 1 here in this tree is the common ancestor of all of the living land plants. All right, so the bryophytes you saw in lab, and we're also going to look at those first here. We just saw moss. The bryophytes, we really could have put these in quotes here because it's not a clade, it's a paraphyletic group. It's really a grade of 3 lineages, the liverworts, the hornworts, and the mosses, that branch off successively. And the exact pattern of branching is still controversial here. But despite what it says in your book, the one thing that's not controversial among botanists is that the liverworts are the first branch off of this tree. So the liverworts are sister to all the other land plants. And we'll look at them in a moment. But